Well, good evening, everyone. Good to see you. This is Pastor Jeff here at Trinity Baptist in Sherwood Park. Welcome to one of our small groups that's meeting here during the fall season. This is kind of a weird small group in that I'm the only one talking, but I do know that many of you are watching throughout the week, if not here on Tuesday night. But it is one of many small groups that we have here at Trinity. We do have some small groups that are meeting in person here at the church building safely. We have other ones that are meeting online. And so if you would like to get a little bit more plugged into the church through something other than just a talking head speaking to you, by all means, let me know, and I'll try and get you hooked up with some other kind of a small group offering as well. But for those of you that are joining here, you know that we are continuing on with our online Bible study of the book of Daniel. And I want to thank some of you who have been giving some feedback through either conversation or emails or anything like that. It's just helpful for me to know that this is reaching people out there who are finding it interesting and helpful for them. So no obligation for you to give feedback, but when you do, just know that it means a lot, especially during this COVID time where I'm not seeing as many of you face to face. But anyway, we are in chapter 6 of the book of Daniel tonight. So if you don't already, I'd encourage you to have a Bible open with you to Daniel chapter 6. Maybe you'll want to have like a nice hot coffee or something because it's kind of getting cold out all of a sudden, kind of gross. But anyway, follow along with me in Daniel 6. We are going to be looking at what is perhaps one of the most famous Bible stories out there of Daniel in the lion's den. I have fond memories of this one growing up with the Sunday school flannel graph and all the characters in it, but maybe you have those kind of memories too. No matter what, no matter if you grew up in church or not, you've probably heard about this story. The theme of the book really seems to shine in this story as well. Something that we've been using as a theme for the book is faithfulness to God when our circumstances are well out of our control. And we're going to see that really shine through today with this particular story. There are some other themes, though, that I'd love for you to just flag in your mind as we go through the story. That of these empires that are turning beastly, and also this familiar thing that we've talked about before, about this need to have the freedom of religion, the freedom of the ability for one to follow their own conscience, especially when things are being thrown at them from a government. So just before we get into the text itself, I want to give you some historical context. Context is always important when we're doing a good Bible study, and we're typically looking at historical context, and then we're looking as well at literary context. So first, historical context. As we know from the book itself, but is well attested to in world history anyway, where we're at in the book of Daniel is this time when the kingdom of Babylon has just fallen and the Persian Empire is on the rise. This is a time in the city of Babylon of incredible change. Maybe a little bit of chaos, but a lot of change that's going on. And as we'll see in the chapter today, there's a desire for stability that possibly influenced Darius to follow some bad advice and to decree a rather dumb law. Darius was mentioned for the first time in our book here at the end of chapter 5, but he's featured a lot in this particular chapter. There is some historical debate about who this guy is. I touched on this ever so briefly last week. I thought I'd give you a little more info this week. Generally speaking, there are 3 options as to who this guy is. First option is that he's a completely fictional character that was invented by the human authors of the Bible. I don't like that option, but it's there in the scholarly debates. Second option is that this Darius is actually Cyrus, and it's just a different name for Cyrus, which is plausible because kings back then, they would have their real names and they would have throne names. Sometimes they would have different names in different languages and such. So if you would do that, you'd have to interpret or translate the last verse of this chapter a little differently, and some people think you can. The third option, though, is that this is a ruler whom Cyrus put in place for at least a year, because when Cyrus overtook and conquered the city of Babylon, history seems to show that he just moved on to do other conquests, but he left someone behind, and could be this Cyrus guy. I prefer this option. Of course, none of us were there back then, so we can't say for sure, but I think this one's pretty plausible. But this Darius guy, just so we're kind of comparing him well with other kings we see in the book, he's a lot better than this Belshazzar guy that we saw back in chapter 5. Belshazzar, last chapter, really sacrilegious. I think that Darius is also a little bit less moody than Nebuchadnezzar. His downfall, he's pretty gullible. He's easily outplayed, and we'll see that happen here in the book. So that's some historical context. Let's remind ourselves of the literary context within the chapter. What we're going to see here is another genre, another example of a court conflict. We've seen that all throughout the book, either court contests or court conflicts. We've got another one going on here. In this chapter, I think we have to really point this out. It's a lot like chapter 3, the story of the fiery furnace. In fact, if you remember this little chart that I've referred to from the BibleProject.ca or .org, I think, we're in this particular story here of the lion's den, which has a parallel to the fiery furnace. Let me ever so quickly rat-a-tat off to you some of the parallels between these stories. We've got jealousy among the Babylonian bureaucrats who are jealous of their very skilled Jewish peers. We have a king who makes a surprising and silly edict that all people must worship them and worship their kingdom. We have a Jewish person or persons who make a very conscious and visible choice to refuse to worship anyone other than the true God. Of course, those jealous Babylonian leaders, they rat out their Jewish peers to the king. The king has to follow through on the consequences for those who disobey the edict. The Jewish person or persons, they don't even resist the consequences. They just fully entrust themselves to God. And God miraculously saves them. And that saving is verified by eyewitnesses, by others. The king issues a kingdom-wide statement at the end of both of these stories, praising the God of Israel, and the Jewish person or persons, they're vindicated. All right, so those are some of the parallels between chapter 3 and chapter 6. Let's actually get into the text itself. Breaks down into 4 sections. Our first section I've called New Kingdom, New Traps. And this is the first 9 verses. Let me just read for you the first couple of verses though. Chapter 6, 1 and 2. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now, kind of obvious again, satraps and administrators, this is a usual terminology for the Persian kind of ruling system. But I want you to notice that this is a sudden imposition of a Persian system to the Babylonian kingdom, which has just fallen. The way that I would maybe think about this in our Canadian context, this is like getting a prime minister waking up someday, maybe a new prime minister, of course, new cabinet shuffle. So everyone beforehand, maybe who's in their former positions, gets shuffled around. And not only that, but a number of the ministries that people are responsible for are getting combined or they're getting separated from something. So, I mean, there's just a lot of chaos. People would not be happy in this scenario. Well, let's keep going. Verse 3. Now, Daniel was so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities, the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Compliment to him. Probably is not going down with his peers, though. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. They're jealous about Daniel's success. And at this point, Daniel's probably been around for about 60 years by now. 60. He's a really, really experienced bureaucrat who knows what he's doing. But they lay the trap on him. Verse 6, they went as a group, and they went to Darius, conspiring. You can see that they started by saying, "May King Darius live forever." That's kind of bar flattery. And then in verse 7, these guys say, all these people we have all agreed. That's a classic tactic. I don't know if you ever had that happen to you, but people maybe a small group of people come to you and say, you know, a whole bunch of us have been talking and we think that you ... I've had that happen. Many people have had that happen. It's a classic tactic where you're trying to make your particular argument sound a lot bigger than it actually is. And to the person that you're saying it to, you can kind of scare them. You can intimidate them by making it sound like basically the whole world is disagreeing with them about something or something like that. Anyway, here comes the edict in the end of verse 7. They want the king to issue an edict and enforce a decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Oh, man. Now, compared to some other kingdoms, it was actually pretty unusual for a Persian king to accept worship as if they were a god. But still, you can imagine Darius sitting there thinking, what have I got myself into here? All this chaos going on in the city. I need to settle things down. You know, maybe to borrow a term, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, right? So maybe he should accept worship. Perhaps this will calm down the chaos. This will unite people. And besides, this decree, it's only effective for 30 days. It's not a forever thing. What's the harm? The clincher, of course, is that the laws of the Medes and the Persians cannot be repealed. I mean, they're permanent. Now, most other kingdoms had a similar sort of thing, but this was going to be something that was referred back to a whole lot. You see that same kind of edict, unchangeable edicts from the Persians mentioned in the book of Esther as well. Look in chapter 8, you'll see it there. So I'm going to stop right here and give us a quick application. You know, as Christians, we are called to pray for our leaders, those who are in authority over us. Whether we agree with them or not, we want to pray for them. But I think this particular bit of the story, as we see it so far, helps us to pray very specifically for them. You see, our leaders, our politicians, they have all kinds of people who are lobbying towards them. Some people with good intentions, some people with not so good intention. People who have pure motives, people with very impure motives, and a whole bunch of people with mixed motives. I think we can pray that our leaders, unlike Darius here, we can pray that our leaders would see people for who they are and see that quickly, that God would give them the insight and the intuition to get a sense of the person's character quickly, so that we don't have what happens in the rest of the story here. Well, anyway, verses 10 to 18. Daniel and Darius get caught in a trap. So the ruling goes into effect. You have these new circumstances that are now imposed upon the whole kingdom. Daniel has no control over this. He's now supposedly not supposed to pray to his God, but only to Darius. But notice Daniel's reaction. He doesn't get on the streets and protest with a bunch of banners, which, to be honest, is a valid option among many, but in his context would have ended very poorly for him. Instead, he just, another temptation for him would have been just to pray silently, not pray out loud, just kind of silently sit there while everyone else is praying. He could be praying to the true God, but keep his outward appearance of compliance. But he didn't choose that option either. Instead, he saw this as a matter of religious freedom, of an edict that overstepped the boundaries of that which human kings should not transgress. But they did. So he went home and he did what he always did. He prayed. Notice his prayer life. It's mentioned here pretty specifically in verse 10. He prayed towards Jerusalem. Got up into the second floor, prayed towards Jerusalem. And there's this very specific reason for this. I'm going to take us back. You can put your finger in Daniel chapter 6. You can flip to 1 Kings chapter 8, starting at verse 46. I want to read for you something that Solomon prays during the dedication of the Jewish temple, well before they were put in exile. So this is a few centuries before. So here's part of the prayer. I think it's just fascinating. When Israel sin against you, God, for there is no one who does not sin, and you become angry with them, you give them over to their enemies, who take them captive to their own lands, far away or near, exile, right? And if they have a change of heart in the land where they are held captive, and repent and plead with you in the land of their captors and say, we have sinned, we have done wrong, we have acted wickedly. And if they turn back to you with all their heart and soul in the land of their enemies who took them captive, and pray to you toward the land you gave your ancestors, toward the city you have chosen, and the temple I have built for your name, then from heaven, your dwelling place, hear their prayer and their plea, and uphold their cause. That is why Daniel is praying towards Jerusalem. We notice as well, he's praying 3 times a day. Is that a Jewish thing? Actually, not really. There's a mention of it briefly in Psalm 55, but it is actually very common in Persian culture. So Daniel may have wisely used Persian prayer times throughout the day to pray to the Israelite God. I can't help but imagine that there are many Christians who live in Muslim-dominated countries in our day. And when they hear the call to prayer that everyone is supposed to follow, praying to Allah, these Christians will use that time of prayer to pray to Christ. Interesting. Let's also notice here that Daniel, what he does there at the end of chapter or verse 10 is that he gives thanks. He gives thanks. Wow, that's fascinating that he can do that in these circumstances. But all these things are things he's been doing before, and he just keeps them up. But we know the story. His jealous peers, they know where to find him. They know his prayer habits. He gets caught. He was ratted out to the king. And again, I want you to notice how this group rats out Daniel to Darius. Verse 12, they ask him to clarify. Didn't you publish this decree? And they get him to confess that, yes, he's the one that made this decree. And they got their answer. In verse 13, then, they level their accusation. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah. Oh my. We heard this accusation recently, earlier in the book. Daniel is again being picked on for being an outsider, for being a non-Babylonian. He's been there, though, for like 6 decades by now. But racism or xenophobia, it just dies hard. And these guys play the race card. Verses 14 through 18, here's what happens as we can read. The king realizes he's been outplayed, that he's also been trapped. He tries to rescue Daniel, but these rulers remind him that your laws can't be changed. So Darius has to follow through on it. He wishes Daniel well. You can see that at the end of chapter or verse 16. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." Well, that's about to happen. And Daniel, he gets thrown in the lion's den. No chance of escape. It's a physical lion's den for sure, but metaphorically, there's kind of another level going on here where both he and Darius have been encircled by lions throughout the whole story. These leaders, these jealous leaders who are going in for the kill. Well, we see the story of God delivering Daniel in verses 19 through 24. Let me read the first few of those verses to you. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the," don't miss that, "living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever." These are the same words as those sneaky leaders used back in verse 6. But behind those same words stand 2 very different sets of character. Don't be flattered by mere words. Look at character. Well, Daniel got lifted out. He got inspected, just like the 3 who were rescued from the fiery furnace got inspected. Totally fine. And then, of course, we can see that there's a bad ending for all these false accusers and for their families. You might think, whoa, and for their families. Is this punishment like overboard? Well, maybe. But it was the choice of the king. This isn't something that's endorsed per se here by God himself. The king did this. But to be honest, in many old cultures back then, including Israel and even some current ones, where there's a concern that there would be continual rebellion by later descendants, people tend to wipe the whole family out. It's a sobering thought, but hey, it happens. Lastly, though, we do see Darius spin around and give a song of praise in the last number of verses. He issues a different decree. And this is much like the decree that Nebuchadnezzar issued at the end of chapter 4, but perhaps maybe it's even a little better. Perhaps. Nebuchadnezzar commanded that no one speak badly of Israel's God. In other words, like just tolerate him. But Darius goes a step further. He commands people to fear and to reverence Israel's God. Personally, if I want to be nitpicky, like wouldn't it be better if all people chose to worship the true God freely? We don't need kings issuing edicts to help us with that. We've got the Holy Spirit doing his work in people's hearts. But anyway, the prayer itself, it goes for the last number of verses there. Again, he affirms that this is the living God and that the living God's kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. I like that last verse too. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Daniel has been faithful to God for about 6 decades of exile. And God, in return, has been very faithful to him too. So that's the story. I want you to notice Daniel's character here. As you can see throughout the whole chapter, until right near the end, Daniel never speaks, barely speaks at all, but his actions speak so loudly. For one thing, he does his job. He's really good at his job, and he has been for years and years. Secondly, he wishes no harm on his adversaries. Yeah, they're trying to take him out, but he's not the one that's trying to do anything like revengeful. So, for yourself in the office politics that maybe you have to put up with, or the schoolyard tactics, let's be like Daniel. Let's wish no harm on our adversaries. Notice that Daniel prays faithfully, and he's got his own regimen for that, and I love it. But he does not worship any empire. He's only going to worship God. And of course, we see him entrust himself to the God who might rescue him or who might not rescue him. But it didn't matter to him. He wasn't going to bend the knee to anyone else but the true God. So I'll ask, does this story remind you of anyone else? Does the story remind you of someone who is falsely accused of threatening social order by saying he would tear down the temple, who claimed to be the King of the Jews? Does the story remind you of someone who was hauled before another ruler of the day, a ruler named Pontius Pilate? And before that ruler was silent. Yeah, Pilate tried to wiggle out of the corner that he'd been backed into, but eventually he had to wash his hands of the situation and just let things fold out according to the law, per se. Does the story remind you of someone who's crucified and thrown into another pit of sorts? Someone who was also rescued by God, but rescued even more dramatically because he was rescued from death itself. He died and then was resurrected. Does the story remind you of someone who will promise someday to totally destroy all evil and evildoers and evil forces so that evil is no more? You know whom I speak of. This story points to him. And though the story section, the narrative sections of the book of Daniel are basically over now at the halfway point, many parts of what follows in the rest of Daniel will continue to point to him. Amen. Let's leave it there for tonight, and we'll pick it up in chapter 7 next week. Thank you so much for joining me. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.